Have you ever experienced a moment where life feels like it's repeating itself? Not in obvious ways, but subtly. Same emotional tone, same internal tension, even though the circumstances keep changing? Imagine standing in line at a grocery store, surrounded by ordinary sounds, ordinary faces, and suddenly sensing that something is slightly off. Nothing dramatic, no clear threat, just a quiet feeling that you've been here before, not physically but internally. The same weight behind the eyes, the same background pressure in your chest. It's as if reality is moving forward, yet something inside you is looping. Most people dismiss this as fatigue or stress and move on, but some moments refuse to fade. They linger like a misalignment you can't quite correct, hinting that the hidden reality beneath your daily routine might not be as neutral as it appears. Within quantum consciousness, perception doesn't merely observe experience, it organizes it, quietly shaping what feels possible before you're aware of it happening. And when that organization begins to repeat itself, the world can start to feel strangely predictable, even imprisoning. If you've ever sensed that walking away right now would mean missing the one insight that explains why this pattern keeps recreating itself, then you already feel the pull of what comes next. And when moments like this surface, there's often a quiet internal agreement that happens before any explanation forms. Not belief, not certainty, just a subtle recognition that something you felt privately is being reflected back to you. That recognition doesn't need a reaction, only acknowledgement. Staying with it, even briefly, allows the pattern to reveal itself instead of disappearing into routine. If you feel the impulse to mark that recognition, leave a single line that begins with, "I noticed that," and let it trail honestly from there, without trying to finish the thought. What follows isn't interpretation or opinion. It's where this repeating experience begins to intersect with observable mechanisms, patterns studied, measured, and quietly documented long before most people realized they were living inside them. What comes next isn't abstract theory. In 1983, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet, working at the University of California, San Francisco, conducted an experiment that quietly unsettled how we understand choice and awareness. Participants were asked to perform a simple voluntary action, like moving a finger, while their brain activity was measured in real time. What Libet discovered was unexpected. The brain showed a measurable buildup of activity, later called the readiness potential, hundreds of milliseconds before the person reported consciously deciding to act. In other words, the system had already begun preparing the action before awareness entered the picture. Conscious intention didn't initiate the process. It arrived late, observing something already in motion. Intuitively, this reframes how control actually works. Awareness isn't the starting point. It's more like a witness stepping in after the first move has been made. When you place this alongside the observer effect in physics, a pattern begins to emerge. In the quantum field, observation doesn't force reality into existence. It selects which potential becomes experienced. In the brain, consciousness doesn't always create action. It registers and stabilizes what the system has already predicted. And this means that you are not passively thinking inside reality. You are participating in how internal predictions become experienced as what's happening, moment by moment. This helps explain why certain emotional states feel automatic, why suffering can appear without an obvious cause. The system prepares the state before you notice it. Then awareness steps in and experiences it as if it were chosen. Over time, this creates the sensation of inevitability. Consciousness expansion, in this light, isn't about gaining control. It's about recognizing when observation is reinforcing a pattern that was already set in motion. But here's the fracture that follows. If awareness consistently arrives after prediction, then what happens when the observer itself becomes conditioned to expect the same internal outcome? That question leads directly into the next layer of the loop, and it's where the mechanism becomes impossible to ignore. And this explains why perception doesn't stabilize through isolated thoughts, but through synchronization. In the early 1990s, neuroscientist Wolf Singer, working at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, studied how distributed regions of the brain communicate during perception. His research on neural synchrony showed that separate neural populations bind information together not by location, but by timing. When neurons fire in coherent rhythms, experience feels unified. When they don't, perception fragments. Reality doesn't disappear, but it loses its sense of continuity. This coherence isn't constant. It forms, dissolves, and reforms depending on internal states, not just external input. The body notices these shifts before the mind interprets them. You might recognize the sudden internal quiet that appears just before a realization, or the brief clarity that arrives without effort, as if mental noise dropped away on its own. Sometimes it feels like a pause behind the eyes, a loosening in the chest, or a moment where intuition feels sharper than thought. These sensations aren't mysterious signals or external forces. They're markers of coherence changing, of neural systems briefly aligning in a new way, altering how information is integrated across the brain. But coherence has a preference. The brain returns most easily to patterns it has synchronized before. Emotional tone, expectation, and memory all influence which rhythms lock together. Over time, the system learns which internal configurations feel stable and recreates them automatically. This is how a resonance loop forms. Perception doesn't just reflect the world, it resonates with familiar internal states, reinforcing them through repetition. And here's the cost. Once you understand that stability and suffering can emerge from the same mechanism, you lose the comfort of believing awareness is passive. Recognition brings precision, but it also removes certain illusions that once made the loop feel invisible. This is usually where things stop feeling abstract, because noticing these mechanisms doesn't come with relief. It comes with distance. A quiet sense of standing slightly apart from conversations that once felt effortless, routines that once felt grounding. You may find yourself listening to people explain their reactions with certainty while something in you hesitates, aware of how much of experience is being filtered, predicted, repeated. That awareness can feel isolating. Not dramatic isolation, but a low, persistent sense of not fully belonging to the surface of things anymore. Doubt follows close behind. Doubt about your interpretations. Doubt about whether you're reading too much into patterns others seem comfortable ignoring. Even familiar places can feel subtly foreign, as if you're present but not entirely inside the moment. This isn't clarity in the way people usually celebrate it. It's a narrowing of easy answers, a loss of certain emotional shortcuts. And yet, beneath that discomfort, something else begins to form. A recognition that what you're experiencing isn't confusion, but a deeper contact with how the system actually works. That recognition doesn't resolve the loop, but it prepares you for the insight that follows, one that reframes what this discomfort has been pointing toward all along. What begins to emerge now is a different way of interpreting what you may have labeled as being different. Not as a malfunction, not as excess sensitivity, but as a shift in how perception is calibrated. Throughout this journey, you've seen how the mind predicts before it perceives, how neural coherence stabilizes experience, and how repeated internal states can quietly recreate the same emotional outcomes. You've also felt the cost of noticing this, the distance, the doubt, the subtle sense of not fully fitting inside explanations that once felt sufficient. Taken together, these aren't signs of something missing. They point to something being perceived with fewer automatic filters in place. From the observer effect to predictive processing to neural synchrony, one implication keeps returning. Reality is not passively received. It is continuously organized by the conditions of observation. And when those conditions shift, even slightly, experience itself feels unfamiliar. Some researchers in consciousness studies have suggested that awareness may not generate reality, but constrain it, much like a lens narrows a field that is otherwise vast. If that's the case, then moments of discomfort, instability, or heightened noticing aren't breakdowns. They're moments where the constraint loosens, where the system has not yet decided how to stabilize what's being perceived. This is where the insight remains intentionally unresolved. Because if perception can expand without immediately settling into a new pattern, then the feeling of being out of sync isn't an endpoint. It's a threshold, one that doesn't announce itself with clarity or relief, but with uncertainty and tension. And once you recognize that threshold, it becomes difficult to ignore the sense that something fundamental is still unfolding, just beyond the edge of what you've learned to expect. If this felt less like learning something new, and more like recognizing something you've been circling for a long time, that's where this chapter naturally settles. Awareness doesn't always arrive with answers. Sometimes it arrives by changing what you're willing to stay with. Choosing to remain connected after a moment like this isn't about commitment or agreement, but about allowing perception to keep unfolding instead of snapping back into familiarity. This exploration continues in the next video, titled, "Why a Single Thought is Enough to Change Your Reality," where the focus shifts from repetition to the fragile point where patterns begin to loosen. Your consciousness brought you here. What happens now is your choice.